Right, so as expected, the first Labour budget of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, the first Labour budget in 14 years, has been a declaration of war on the working class. £40 billion worth of tax rises and not a single wealth tax in sight to pay for any of it. So naturally the vast majority of the entire tax hike burden is falling on everyone else. And that sums up this Labour in name only government entirely. A budget that was delivered with a strong ethos on the choices Rachel Reeves was making and the choices she has made, despite some pantomime kind of giveaways which amount to nothing important, but which are leading to the highest tax burden on ordinary working class people on record. It is a war on the working class. And worse, she couldn't even be straight about that, because where ostensibly the bulk of these tax rises are being put on employers through massive national insurance hikes, a broken manifesto promise on steroids as that is on its own, the knock-on effects will affect employees as well, through employment opportunities, pay rises, potential job losses even, and all of it completely counterintuitive to the growth Labour says that it wants. Rachel Reeves made it painfully obvious, even as she stated it at the beginning of her budget speech, that she was a former Bank of England economist, because quite clearly she absolutely knows the cost of everything, but she knows nothing of the value of it. Right, so one of the biggest budgets in living memory just dropped, and it's being justifiably shredded for all it is worth as a result of where the burden of tax increases are coming, huge tax increases are coming, where they're being placed, and the knock-on effect that will have for ordinary working class people up and down the country, which are not necessarily immediately obvious, but absolutely are when you start to dig into the detail just a little bit. A 40% increase in the tax burden on this country gave the Tories a field day. The biggest tax hike in a single budget since Black Wednesday in 1993. The Tories again as that was. Not that Sunak's Tories, in all honesty, can say much of having raised the tax burden as high as it already is, an all-time high as it already is. But if Labour wanted to be different, to offer change, to make a mark and really promote growth in this country, in our economy, in practice, they've done absolutely nothing of the sort. Where I could discuss Labour's spending plans, which are partly responsible, of course, for the scale of rises as we see them, the big issue, more than half of the tax burden, is all in relation to that £22 billion fiscal black hole Labour are still claiming to have found, despite not making it immediately clear how that has come about. Reeves claims a breakdown of this is now going to be published. Frankly, if it's taken this long for them to release any detail about that, despite freedom of information requests being put in and refused, in my view, it's taken them this long to actually spin a yarn to explain it, though part of the reason for it, she now says, is the cuts to national insurance that the Tories made at their last budget, with a view towards working towards abolishing national insurance completely. Therefore, slapping a huge increase in employers' national insurance contributions was, in terms of her speech, an easy sell to the country, she thinks. This move in and of itself is singularly the biggest disaster for ordinary working class people across the country, because whilst it is being levied on employers, it will knock on to employees. And it is against this background that all other budget pledges to working people that are on the face of it perhaps a good thing must be taken in the context of. For a start, when Starmer's Labour and Rachel Reeves say they want growth, say that this is their priority and driving ethos of this Parliament, the fact that the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, are predicting lower growth in the short term ought to immediately tell people they're being sold a bit of a pup here. There's a bit of a con at work. Where businesses previously didn't start paying national insurance on behalf of employees until earnings passed £9,100, that threshold has now been dropped to £5,000. So that's one heck of a big whack in national insurance contributions that employers must now find. But on top of that, the percentage of those employer national insurance contributions have just gone up by just over 1% to now stand at 15%. So a percentage rise on top of the threshold for paying employers national insurance being virtually halved, so that of that 40% tax rise that we've looked at across this budget, this is accounting for some 25% of that. Now, for some small businesses who were entitled to claim small business employment allowance, this previously allowed them to get £5,000 knocked off their employer's national insurance bills if they qualified for it. They are now entitled to get more than double the previous level of relief, £10,500 now, ostensibly great for them on the face of it. However, their national insurance bills will still rise. So how much of an actual saving they will get, we'll have to wait until suppose some economic bod crunches those numbers properly, but it's one of those things that always takes days to work out and come to light. But the saving will certainly be less than it appears at first glance, and of course it's going to vary business to business. So how will this end up hitting employees then, Damo? Well, Starmer and Reeves in their manifesto promised no VAT or income tax or national insurance hikes. But that has been well and truly broken. That promise is bust. They've since tried to fudge that claim by saying no VAT or income tax or national insurance hikes on working people. Though this is equally as dishonest, since small business owners aren't all sat on their Todd watching someone else make money for them. They are working people themselves. So this is also a lie. But if we look solely at employees for a moment, though, it's bad news for them too. Pay rises will be much reduced, harder to come by, or killed off completely as a result of these rises. And an increase in contributions, the more an employee gets paid, of course. Also, when you get employed, your employers have to think about how employing you is going to affect them. The wage they must obviously pay you, but also those higher national insurance contributions, pension contributions, and other odds and sods. With national insurance rising on the scale that it is, that's less money in their budgets for further pay rises. So they may be smaller, or you may not get one at all. And your boss can blame this tax hike by the Labour government on them as you blame for that. Could also mean employers could just employ less people, may even end up having to let people go. It's not business friendly, and it's not worker friendly either. Worst of both worlds. National insurance contributions are functionally a stealth tax in and of themselves. For a government that says it wants growth, this will have the complete opposite effect as reflected in those OBR forecasts short to medium term. Businesses won't invest, won't take on more people, you won't have more cash in your pocket to spend, which is the biggest contributor of economic growth, especially as inflation continues to rise, all contributing to an economy that has been hit by a not very clever budget. This is not a budget for working people at all. It is an attack on them. And if Labour thinks we won't notice, well, they're very, very wrong. At this point, I need to mention the minimum wage rise, of course, which naturally will now be an enforced wage hike upon employers who pay it as well. The minimum wage is going to go up to $12.21 for employees over 21 years of age and up to £10 an hour for those aged 18 to 20. And that always sounds great. And of course, it is great at the bottom line on the face of it. But in fact, it is just a wage hike of just 70 pence. It's not much at all, but it still puts that little bit more pressure on a smaller employer, more likely to be paying minimum wage. And then, of course, against this background, we have to look at the attack on welfare. The crackdown on all of that 0.2% of fraud or error found amongst disability benefits, and the only slightly higher rate of it in universal credit. The top up for an awful lot of people on low wages as that is. And for those who are not working, the added emphasis to drive them back into work in this budget, when there is likely to be less jobs available following the national insurance hike, cannot be ignored either. And during all of this stress, the government will be spying on your bank account looking for any sign of cash they might be able to claw back from you at that. Carer's allowance is worthy of a mention because I am a carer myself. I was formerly on this carer's allowance, as this is going to go up to the equivalent of 16 hours work a week on the minimum wage. Therefore, in theory, you can work that much and not lose your money, not lose your carer's allowance. But there's still no sign of a taper. It's still the sharp cut-off to it. And again, it's finding the work when employers might not be offering as many work opportunities going forwards when you suddenly become a lot more expensive to employ. Fuel duty being frozen was somewhat unexpected. That'll help you drive to work, great, but it's hardly a green policy when we should be trying to encourage more public transport use. But then you look at bus fares, don't you? And the cap on those is going up 50% to £3 for a single fare, up from £2. And just to rub in how stupid an idea this was, Manchester's Metro Mayor, Labour himself, Andy Burnham, has already said he's mitigating this and keeping it at £2 for people in Manchester. For everyone catching the bus to work everywhere else, though, this is going to be the equivalent of a 4% income tax hike on you. A commuter tax, if you like, punishing you for going green, punishing you for using the bus. The same really goes for the 50% increase in air passenger duty, which, for those who use such travel in their work, they're unlikely to be on wages where they won't bat an eyelid at this anyway. But again, not a green way to go to deal with climate change. £10 million boost for the NHS. That might sound great, but given the NHS employs 1.6 million people, we have to come back to those national insurance increases again. And those national insurance increases, as the NHS is an employer of 1.6 million people, is going to wipe off £3.3 billion of that £10 billion increase, leaving a mere extra 3% on the whole NHS budget. Therefore, this ends up being a rise only just above the rate of inflation. So much for the party of the NHS actually protecting it then. And of course, anywhere else where there is investment in employment and that kind of thing now is all going to be set against that national insurance rate and that rise. The NHS is just a prime example of it. Corporation tax for the big businesses remains unchanged at 25%, so it is still the lowest in Europe. So there was wiggle room to charge more there by Rachel Reeves. She simply chose not to. Again, she's let the richest and the most powerful get away with it. Changes to capital gains tax are too timid as well and remain at a lower rate than income tax for people who work. So much for siding with working people again. 20% is the lower rate of income tax, 18% for capital gains. It's wrong, it's absurd, and Reeves has intentionally chosen her choice to give up raising an additional £15 billion by just not equalising income tax and capital gains tax. There was no sign of a wealth tax anywhere here. The easiest choice Reeves should have been able to make to raise large amounts of money, and didn't. And that shows which side Starmer's Labour is really on. The donor class. There was no mention of the winter fuel allowance, so 10 million people are still going to lose it in this country. There was no mention of the two-child benefit cap, so poor families will still lose out to that as well. But alcohol duty being cut in the pub, the draft alcohol duty is a policy being heavily promoted by Labour online right at this second in time, but basically just equates to 1 penny off the cost of a pint of beer. No doubt more issues that all fundamentally come back to those massive employer national insurance tax hikes will be identified in the coming days. It always takes time to pull apart a budget, and this one was absolutely huge. But it's also absolutely awful for ordinary working class people. Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have well and truly turned the Labour Party into just another bunch of Tories. For more on how badly those at the mercy of the Department for Work and Pensions will have it, I went into far more detail on the specifics of those policies in this video recommendation here from just the other week as your suggested next watch. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.